know that people who are diabetic on a higher carb diet can actually lose weight and then reverse their diabetes. We know that people have been eating lots of carbs for thousands of years. So it's very frustrating because the more that I understand, the more I almost want to sort of back out of the whole nutrition science communication space.
What is up, my friend, and welcome to the Legendary Life Podcast. I'm health expert Ted Rice, coach to entrepreneurs, executives, and other high-performing professionals. And what we do here at Legendary Life is break down science-based information on how to lose fat, prevent disease, and live a long, healthy, legendary life. So if that's what you're into, you are in the right place. Click that subscribe button wherever you listen to podcasts so that every time one of my episodes goes live, you'll be the first to know. So let's get into the interview with Kevin Bass. Kevin Bass, welcome to the Legendary Life Podcast, man. Really excited to have the Twitter legend, which we'll talk about in a little bit. So thanks so much for doing this.
Thanks so much for having me, Ted.
Just to give people some context for the people who are listening who don't know who you are, you and I, we met through Twitter. You started this whole thing with Joe Rogan. For those of you who are listening now who don't even know who Joe Rogan is, ooh, I saw your Oura ring because we're doing a video. I've got rocking mine, you know. So anyway, you started this thing. You called Joe Rogan out, who, by the way, again, if you don't know who Joe Rogan is because you're super busy not paying attention to podcasts, he's the number one podcaster, has these 3-hour-long podcasts, and you called him out, even though he is not a nutrition guy. He has a lot of health and nutrition people on, and you called him out because he preferentially has low carb people on his show, extolling the benefits of low carb. You did this amazing thing where you went and PhD style. We'll talk about, your academic background in a second, but you just you did statistics on when he talked about who he had on, who promoted low carb, and all these other details. And it was clear that what you were calling him out on was you were right about it, right? Objectively, and you used data to prove it. And since then, it's kind of blown things up for you. And in fact, you've done, I just want to point this out. I'm sure you're aware, but since this is the first time we're talking, you are the reason that guys like Lane Norton, BioLane, for love him or hate him, he does represent someone who is more objective, more when it comes to nutrition, and also has a PhD in nutritional biochemistry, I believe. I've had him on the show a while back. So that's how this all started. And we're going to be catering to my audience who may not know who you are, but also all the followers on Twitter who have been, when I asked, do you have anything to ask Kevin, and all your followers. So Kevin, do you want to just briefly introduce yourself, since this is the first interview that you've done, and just what do you want people to know about you?
So I'll start as a kid. Whenever I was a kid, I had a lot of medical problems. Doctors couldn't figure out what the problems were, and I really struggled as a result of that. A lot of academics even struggled, and I was actually a really angry young man in large part because of this. And I almost failed out of high school. I failed chemistry twice. The second time, the reason that I passed and actually graduated instead of had to repeat a year was my teacher. And during my final quiz, I didn't really know what I was doing, but I did my best. And then I brought it up to her, and she looked at it for maybe 2 or 3 seconds, and she said, "This is fantastic, great job." And then she wrote 100 on it without possibly knowing whether or not I certainly didn't get 100. So that teacher allowed me to graduate. Then I got my stuff together. Things got a little bit better right after high school. And I also realized I really had to get things together or else I would end up on a path that I wasn't going to be happy with. So went to a community college, got a 4.0, did well in the SAT, and got really lucky. I just applied to a school that my friends were going to. I didn't really know much about colleges or what good colleges were or anything like that. So I applied to a school that a bunch of my friends went to. I did that, and then I got in. I think everybody was surprised. I was surprised. I went off to University of Texas at Austin. It's a good state school in Austin. I got 2 degrees there, one in biology and one in anthropology. I was actually sort of leaning towards the anthropology. I really admired hunter-gatherers. I ate like one for that time. I got into paleo during that period in a big way, and also into bodybuilding. And I gained more than 40 pounds. And eventually it was about almost 40 pounds of muscle. I was a really big guy. And I would eat like 10 or 20 eggs a day. And, I was just all into that fitness and stuff and doing things in that kind of...
That's just like how hunter-gatherers did, right? 20 eggs a day,
exactly.
Egg whites,
20,
protein shakes.
20 eggs a day.
Paleo protein shakes.
Yeah, and then... after undergrad, I still wasn't sure what I wanted to do. I wasn't too excited about medicine, partly because of the experiences I had younger. I was very negative about medicine. I thought that it, was just a way for pharmaceutical companies and doctors and academics to make profits while everybody else was sick, because the underlying reasons that people are sick have nothing to do with, a lack of medicine. It's because of lifestyle. So why don't we just change these big lifestyle things? And the people who don't care about changing these big lifestyle things and just want to symptom manage, they're just trying to make profits and at the expense of everybody else, the expense of actually dealing with the real problem. So that was my thinking. And there's some half truth to that, but there's also truth from the other side as well. But so I spent about 6 years in biomedical research and actually a year in anthropology. And then I decided, well, you know what? Medicine's not perfect, but it's one way to help people in small, tiny ways. And my attitude was sort of changing, because obviously I realized I wasn't going to usher in a revolution that made everything okay for everybody. So then I decided, okay, maybe if I can help people in the small ways, day by day, piece by piece, maybe that could be somewhat fulfilling, even though it wasn't what I necessarily wanted. And I didn't, I thought would be best for everybody or whatever. So I applied to medical school. I was still even pretty negative about it, and like very ambivalent about it while I was doing the interview process. But anyway, I got into a school again in Texas. Then actually over the course of the first year, I really started to understand why medicine really was helpful for people. So even though lifestyle issues are underlying a lot of this, genetics are also a small part as well. But even though that's true, like medicine still can make people's lives better. And until we have some sort of, golden revolution where, everybody's forced to be healthy, which is, not much of a revolution in many ways, just trying to make people's lives better in small ways is important. And also, even though I was even kind of extreme during this time about the modern world itself, I thought that the modern world was something that was a net negative for people. There are some things that have been very positive about it, right? Now we can feed everybody. Now people don't die of infectious diseases.
Literacy rates, infant mortality rates.
Totally.
Absolutely.
And
internet connections.
But even like some people will say that hunter-gatherers, they grow to ripe old ages without disease, without dental care. That's not actually true either. If you looked at hunter-gatherers, especially the ones before they made contact with civilization and they started getting some of the benefits of civilization without actually having to live within civilization, the mode for us is way, way higher than that, right? So and our life expectancy is way longer. So even though we do get diabetes, we get heart disease, all these other things, it wasn't awesome for them either. They were dealing with infections and with like bone degeneration, with parasites and all those other kinds of things that caused them to die earlier. And actually the inflammation from their constant infectious disease exposure caused them to age faster, which we don't have to deal with. But anyway, and then actually during my medical school, my first couple of years of medical school, I also realized that even though I want to help people from day to day, I also am just really intellectually passionate. I'm passionate about ideas. I love ideas, and medical school is very superficial. So you learn how to diagnose diseases, you learn how to treat the disease, you learn what the side effects are, you learn what the basic mechanisms of the drugs are, but you don't learn anything in any more detail than that. Like one or two big points from each of those areas, and you learn how to distinguish between diseases, but you don't learn like the deep physiology, the deep reasons why we get these diseases. And so that was still And then of course, yeah. And like, you don't learn anything about longevity. You don't learn anything about nutrition. So that was my motivation for during medical school. I was like, you know what? I'm not, and then I was also told by people who were my upperclassmen, the people who were in the clinical years, they're like, Kevin, don't worry about all that preclinical stuff. It's way too much detail for what you need in medicine. I was like, wait a second. Like, this isn't detailed enough.
Right. That's everything. Right.
So
that's the whole thing right there.
So I wanted to learn more about these things. I didn't want to learn less. I didn't want to go into the superficial level and then just learn algorithms and protocols and not really understand anything I was doing. Because for the most of the diseases, including heart disease, diabetes, and all these other diseases that we were learning in med school, I actually didn't even understand how they worked. Like, why do those diseases happen? Okay, we know that the blood sugar goes up. We know that the insulin, I don't even know if we learned about insulin resistance, honestly. I just know that we have this pill that increases insulin sensitivity, allows the blood sugar to go down. And then we know the side effects. That's literally all we learned. And then we only spent like
just
a couple days.
Take some metformin, right?
Exactly. Take some
just
metformin.
Give them the metformin.
And then, totally. And then we have to learn, like, basically you have to learn everything in medicine, not just the things that are most common. So even though we deal with like diabetes, heart disease, dementia and all that stuff, even those are the most common diseases that we're dealing with from a day-to-day basis, we actually have to learn, like, okay, what is this rare infectious parasite from Africa? What are the symptoms that you get from this? What is this rare lysosomal disease that almost nobody's ever going to see? So we actually only spend like a few weeks total on the major diseases in like the first years of med school. And so that really bothered me, and I wanted to go deeper. So I decided to apply internally for the PhD program. I got in after I did a master's actually after my second year, because I wanted to see if I could do research. And then I did well, and then they let me into the PhD program, and then I've been doing that for the last couple of years. And now I study the ketogenic diet in the context of cancer, and then some of the mechanisms by which the ketogenic might work or might not work. So I think that's a pretty good overview of my. Oh, and then you want to talk about, the Rogan thing. I've been pretty critical of a lot of there's a lot of people who push a lot of pseudoscience on Twitter. And I've been pretty critical about that. One of the things that really got me into the longevity space, and especially like sort of the molecular biology of longevity, and we can talk about some of that later, and also it has to do with my project, was watching Joe Rogan interview Rhonda Patrick. Some of those interviews are amazing, and that's what actually really got me like really passionate about science. I was really into science and learning about how diseases worked, but hearing those interviews on Joe Rogan's show is what really like opened up so many new avenues and ways of thinking about how we could use modern biomedical science, even like the hardcore, really detailed molecular biology, to help with these diseases. So I've been a follower of and watching Joe stuff forever, like ever since for like 3 or 4 years. And so I was really familiar with all the health people he had on. I was really familiar with basically a lot of the criticisms about those people, because it's overwhelmingly biased in favor of low carb. He likes to trash carbs.
That's what's hot right now. The marketing behind it is strong. And especially the water loss that people experience at the beginning. They're like, wow, I lost so much water and glycogen. This is awesome. But you're not losing fat. But anything that gets the scale to go down, really, like, people think it's magic. Yeah, we can get into that. Please continue, though.
Well, I mean, I would just add is that also you're just excluding all of the really nasty stuff that causes people to gain weight in the first place, like the heavily processed foods, the hyperpalatable foods like candy bars, pastries, baked goods, all that stuff. You're excluding that, and then now you're replacing that with a lot of protein. And yeah, it's like, it's no wonder people lose weight, but it's not necessarily because it's low carb. It might be just because they're excluding all those things. But to keep going. So how do I tell the story? So
why don't we even jump in like this? Because someone asked a good question. I think we can just get into it right away. People ask, or I'd be interested to hear his thoughts on why so many of the influential nutritional experts seem to disagree with each other. Before you jump in, I just want to say this. People get really confused about who should be called an expert and who shouldn't be when it comes to reading research, interpreting that research, seeing what it really means. And a lot of the people that are followed are great at marketing, because we're in a situation now. I got into a discussion on Instagram the other day, and because I was talking about calories and energy balance, and someone, quote unquote, I'm using air quotes right now for those of you not watching the video, but trying to school me by saying, well, listen, and I don't want to name names, but, they named a few people off. And I'm like, yeah, I follow those two people, those three people you mentioned too. You want to know why? Because they're great at marketing. They're great business people. One of them has an MBA from Wharton's. Okay. It's like, these are people who have figured out, and we can even talk about this, because guys like you, and I would put myself in the camp, even though I'm not in an MD, PhD program, but I'm in the camp where I believe that people deserve good evidence-based information, or I kind of don't like that term. It's loaded because it's become like a cult as well, just like the low carb people. But it's like, okay, real science-based information, because it works. It works, right? And when it does work, we understand why it works, instead of like what you mentioned with low carb, where people are losing water, or people are getting rid of ultra processed foods, or like you mentioned, the hyper palatable foods, which are actually usually high in fat and sugar. Yeah. That's what makes them hyper palatable in the first place. But they're like, oh, I stopped eating ice cream, which, if you look on a Haagen-Dazs container, it's mostly fat by caloric, by percentage calorie wise, but they stop eating that stuff. And then they raised protein, like you mentioned too. Yeah. And all of a sudden, the thermic effect of the eating more protein, and all these other things are at play, but no, it was the low carb. And then people promote that, these people, and man, it makes money. And I feel like there's got to be a way of getting the truth out there and putting it into proper context in a way that is putting forth what we know. Well, I'll call it the truth, but of course, science is always evolving. New studies are always coming out, and there's many nuances, but understanding that truth so that we can get better results and don't have to argue so much and fall into nutra-religious tribalism. And so when a person like you comes on and starts calling people out, or some of what I do, I'm a little bit less, I guess, assertive, I'll say, on social media than you are. I'm not a big Twitter star like you, Kevin, but there's got to be a way of getting people good information and really just being more objective about it. And so that we understand what works, how it works, and when something doesn't work, why someone needs to change. I'll give you an example just real quick, and then I want to hear what you have to say. But there was a person, I was in I don't know if it was a keto group or carnivore group. And this guy, he's like, oh, I lost 40 pounds on keto, and then I transitioned to carnivore because, hey, that's even more popular and better. And so it's got to give better results. And he gained 20 pounds back and didn't understand why that happened. When you and I, we know exactly why that happened. We know exactly. There's no arguments about energy balance. There's no arguments about the first law of thermodynamics. You cannot create fat out of nothing. It costs 2 calories per a pound just to have on your body, right?
Yeah.
So what do you have to say about all that? I just went off on my little tirade. How do you look at all of what's going on with these nutritional experts?
Yeah. There's so many things that we could talk about. And so I'll just comment on some of that, because it's hard to comment on. It's like there's a lot going on. So one of the things to note is that we're in a really important historical moment, a transition in terms of the way we consume media. And we're transitioning from what was once sort of a subscriber-based model where you'd pay for a newspaper, a certain amount every month, and then you'd get a certain level of quality. Now we're moving from a subscriber model more towards a pay per click model. So the more clicks that you give somebody, the more money that they can make. Different news organizations, even different diet gurus, and then in addition to that, the authorities of who we listen to, the gatekeepers are no longer able to control that flow of information as they once did, which means that outrage culture becomes a big deal, call outs, all that stuff, sensationalism. I would even say extreme diets are part of this, right? The more sensational and extreme and sort of countercultural, the more attention you're going to get. And the more that the algorithms, the social media algorithms are going to reward you and promote your stuff. So the more engagement you get, the more visible your tweets are going to be made by Twitter or by Facebook, in the case of posts in that case. And so we actually used to have a situation like this in the media where before we got to the subscriber model, I think that happened in like the 1950s or 60s. If you remember from like high school, middle school, about yellow journalism, like this, I think there was a Spanish-American War, and there were all these wars that we had in the early 20th century that were in large part driven by the newspapers. The newspapers would whip up the fury for war, the enthusiasm for war. And that was in part because the newspapers in that time were not based on a subscription model. That happened later, that transitioned to the it was based on each paper had to be bought. So you'd walk by the newsstand, somebody would be calling out this, the news in the papers. So the most sensational and extreme newspaper was the one that ended up selling. So the newspapers in that day were very quackish and very like sensationalized and not objective, not impartial like the norms of journalism were supposed to have been in the late 20th century. And then now we're switching back to that model almost in the early 20th century again, which is now that's what we're having. And it's infecting everybody. It's infecting even the mainstream, the good news organizations.
They got to survive. They got to do it to survive. In fact, they're dying out. All their old people, all the people who are so loyal to them are getting older and eventually dying out. There's all these new people. It's like they're not interested in that. They want to follow Kevin Bass or Joe Rogan or whoever.
Yeah. So I think that's important to understand. It's like we're in a media situation that's unique, but also not unique. And understanding our place in that historical moment is important. And so as far as how do we evaluate evidence? What does evidence-based mean? So first of all, I'd say that I don't like using the term evidence-based because first off, as you pointed out, it's like overused. It's become like meaningless because everybody wants to think they're evidence-based. And actually, it's not that hard to be evidence-based in the very superficial meaning of that term, especially in nutrition. Because in nutrition science, like there's always going to be studies that are done this way according to this methodology or that methodology, and they're always going to find different things. And so you can always be evidence-based in nutrition and actually have any point of view. You can be a carnivore who's evidence-based. You can be a paleo person who's evidence-based. You can be a vegan who's evidence, just because anybody can base anything on any evidence. Or rather, you can always find evidence to support anything. So then the question is okay, how do we come up with a systematic way of evaluating evidence that's impartial and unbiased, as opposed to just trying to find our point of view? And that's what real evidence-based medicine is, or evidence-based nutrition. And I don't think, that's what real evidence-based medicine is. So the people who I know who teach evidence-based medicine at some of the top universities in the world, they actually have a systematic way of evaluating evidence and thinking about evidence so that it does result in unbiased evaluation. Now, when most people say I'm evidence-based, most people have no training in evidence-based medicine or in being evidence-based in that sense, in like the systematic sense of evidence-based medicine. They just call it evidence-based because I found a study. So I personally don't have training in evidence-based medicine. I'm friends with a bunch of people who do. Like, if you really want to follow, I'll just do some shout outs. David Noonan on Twitter is really good. A lot of people at sort of the Oxford, a lot of British people are really good about that, especially at the really good British universities. That's where a lot of these ideas came from, is from Britain and from like people around Cochrane collaboration and that kind of thing. But even in the evidence-based community, there's still philosophical differences. Like even among people who actually know what they're talking about, not the SC Malholtras or whatever, who's just it's not even worth listening to them. But even among the people who are serious about evidence-based medicine, they have philosophical differences. So there is a question about what being evidence-based means, and we need to talk about I think the main thing we need to be talking about in this nutrition space is, how do I go about evaluating the evidence in an unbiased and systematic way? And I think that's work that I would like to do to communicate how that's done. That's a fixation of mine, a real big interest of mine. And I can't answer that question right now, but you need to define it ahead of time before you actually start looking at the evidence, and not change the way you think about it based upon what you find. And I think basically almost nobody does that except people who are rigorously trained in this. So the other thing is incentives. The incentives right now are to overplay things. And if you're like selling a diet, or you're selling workshops, you're selling whatever you're selling, if you can be as sensational as possible, and then it's easier to sell things. So even if the people who believe in these sensational things, like even if they actually believe in them, these people are actually going to rise to the top of the social media hierarchy, because simply for the fact that they're the most sensational. And then there's no incentive for people like you or me, or especially really serious and sober academics, to call these people out. They're not selling anything. They're not going to gain anything monetarily from any of that. They might help themselves a little bit, and they're like, other people might read their papers, but they might not actually. They might actually, by arguing with idiots, they might actually make themselves look worse and pull their own.
So what happened to Stefan Guillenet a little bit when he was on Joe Rogan and talked with, what's his name? Gary Taubes.
Yeah.
A lot of people commented on Stefan's demeanor instead of what he was saying, and it's kind of this like primate politics sort of situation where, a lot of our evolutionary wiring and how our brains work, like, I like that guy, it's kind of that type of,
yes,
I like that guy. He really told that guy, that type of attitude. And it's just like, well, you may not like him. Like some people don't like you. I remember someone who listened to my podcast was like, why are you retweeting his stuff? I don't like his attitude. It's like, well, I don't know him. Obviously you're a good dude. We've been talking for a little bit before we even hopped on and, started doing this. And he was critical of some of the way you were criticizing. So he was criticizing the way you were criticizing. I forget exactly what it was, but we're in this situation where it's like, also, I think people need to be a little bit cooler with, like when I said when I mentioned about all the people who study marketing, because that's what I found myself in a situation. Like I was really good at what I was doing. Nobody cares. Why? Because the way I communicate, I wasn't communicating in a way that was getting people's attention in a way that caused them to eventually hire me. And so the reverse of that is that we're in this situation where like a lot of people like you and me, we're not focused on studying marketing. We're focused on studying the stuff that actually helps people. And then now we stumble and bumble through communicating it on Twitter, on a medium like Twitter or Instagram. It's a little easier, I think, having conversations like this, but even it can be hard on a conversation. Some people might listen to this and take away something completely different than what we wanted them to. Right?
Yeah.
And it's because you're not an expert. This is the first interview that you've ever done. Right? Now, and I think it's important that if you're developing awareness, I'm like, okay, well, why do you like that person? Just because they seem badass, or like Gary Taubes really told Stefan, like I've interviewed Stefan 3 times. The dude is brilliant, whether you love him, hate him, whatever. And Gary Taubes is, I guess you would call him a good journalist, but that's about as far as it goes, and a good promoter of his work, but that's as far as it goes. Do you have any follow-up on that, or any perspective you want to share?
Yes, I think that certainly the marketing is a big thing, and I think it's done intentionally. I think they say extreme things and ridiculous things on purpose, and even I find myself at times falling into the trap of being one-sided. I try not to be, and that's the other thing about Twitter, though. It's like in one tweet you can't explain like everything you mean, and sometimes what people really want to retweet, they don't want to retweet these long threads. They want to retweet the one sort of one-sided tweet, and so there's an incentive even for us to try to play that game I've done that in the past. I think I do that less now, and I am trying to do that. Like in order to play the social media game, you have to, and if you want to be big or whatever, you have to, well, there's different ways, but if you want to do the Twitter thing and you want to do it from Twitter, there's this, you have to be sort of exaggerated. And that's I think a basic problem with the medium itself. And I was joking about banning Twitter earlier, but honestly, this medium is toxic. And the way that the algorithms are done, or the way that the platform runs, I would argue needs to be modified to be more healthy for people. But it's a hard discussion to have, because then you could start saying, well, what needs to be modified and what needs to be regulated? Like, do we need to start regulating supermarkets? And then we get into this whole, like, what is the role of the government in deciding these things? And I think actually that's a really good discussion to have. But I do know that Twitter is quite toxic, and it promotes toxicity. And I will talk a little bit about Gary Taubes. He's an amazing storyteller. If you read his book, Good Calories, Bad Calories, not only is he an amazing storyteller, he's an amazing rhetorician, and he's also an amazing, like, he also clearly has an amazing mind. I don't think he's scientific.
Right, he's not a dumb guy. Right. There's a difference there.
Not.
There's a nuance there. Yeah.
Yeah. The other thing I'll say is, you mentioned how people will often have these diets where they change like 5 or 10 things at once, and they'll be like, oh, it was the carbohydrate restriction and I reversed my fatty liver disease and now I have like all these muscles or whatever. And the interesting thing is in addition to that problem, that's actually a problem even the scientific literature itself. Overwhelmingly, when you have a ketogenic diet in the rodent literature for cancer, almost overwhelmingly, it's going to be pretty dramatically protein restricted. And we know that protein restriction in animal models actually prevents cancer and causes slower growth of cancer. So it's actually, even in the animal model literature itself, it's confounded by these multiple changes at the same time. There's a few papers that are not confounded, and often the papers that are not confounded find no effect. So that's another fascinating thing. Even scientists are making this mistake and this error. So we just have and then I think the other thing is we have an overwhelming low level of nutritional literacy. Like, we don't learn nutrition science in schools. We don't learn the basics of nutrition science in schools. We don't learn the basics of how to eat healthfully, how to cook in your, house. I didn't know how to cook until I was in my 20s, right? Whereas, in Japan, where my wife is from, they start learning how to cook when they're in kindergarten, K through 12. They have something called shokuiku, where it's like basically home economics. They learn where the food comes from. They learn they learn how to cook. They learn all of these basic life skills that everybody needs, that are actually, in my opinion, it's kind of a public health need. So why isn't the educational system actually doing that? And so the fact that people don't have that, it's very easy to fall prey to fad diets. And I've fallen prey to many fad diets, especially when I was first starting to understand nutrition, because people can come up with these plausible hypotheses that are based on a certain slanted view of the evidence that it's not true. It's not true,
right.
But it's hard to know that it's not true unless you're an expert. So the level of expertise at the population level is very low. So it's just rife for being able to do this and sell bullshit to people.
Yeah, and by the way, yeah, we don't really know each other that well. And actually, some of the people who've been listening to me ever since I started this podcast 5 years ago, I used to be like a hardcore low carber. For me, it was really simple. It was, all right, people with diabetes are fat. Okay, how do they get that way? Well, you eat carbs. Carbs raise insulin. And the insulin stores the carbs as fat. You get fat. Do you see how simple that is? I don't need no PhD for that, man. And then you realize, well, actually, diabetes is more of an issue with fat metabolism. If you talk to diabetes experts, which I've had on my show, it's actually, and you can absolutely, eating more energy than you burn or eating a caloric excess, you can absolutely give yourself diabetes. You just can very effectively manage your hemoglobin A1C and fasting glucose levels by keeping the carbs low, but you still have diabetes because it's this excess of fat caused by excess of calories, and the low compared to how much you're burning. And man, there's all these nuances. And then I was talking to one of my clients today, we were discussing triage theory, which is, for those of you who don't know, you can, and so this is really important because I think a lot of people don't understand just how complicated nutrition is and how things are separate from one another. So you can lose fat in a healthy way by a modest deficit, all the things we know how to do, keeping protein at a certain level and either, raising carbs or fat, depending on what someone feels better on. But you can lose fat in an unhealthy way. You can be stranded you can be like Tom Hanks on Castaway. And I think that's a really important point because, by the way, I'm in Thailand right now. I'm not in America. And I've been traveling through Southeast Asia the past 2 years. I don't know if I mentioned that to you or not. And it's really obvious, what the problem is. Only in a place like America and I guess Canada and Australia and perhaps the UK, it's like, why are we so fat? It must be big pharma and big food conspiring to put the toxins and the electromagnetic radiation and, it's the hormones. And it's like, no, dude, there's more. I'm eating more pesticides now that aren't even allowed in the United States and Thailand, but I'm just eating more vegetables and the portions are smaller. And by the way, the noodles and the rice are the main, that's the main dish. And the other stuff is like kind of supplementary to the big bowl of noodles or big serving of rice that you get. And that's common in every Asian country that I've been to, not that I've been to them all. So it's like people don't know all these different things and how fat loss is separate from maybe gut health, or fat loss is separate from suboptimal micronutrient status. Like if you're familiar with triage theory from Bruce Ames, Rhonda Patrick's mentor. So there's all these nuances, so complicated, and it's a mess. So if you're listening and you're like, well, no, it's real simple. It's not, like you said, Kevin, like even these, researchers who are brilliant people, obviously highly intelligent, highly trained, people who spent their whole lives going to school and studying. I mean, they still make mistakes and are prone to bias, just like every other human being.
Yeah. Yeah. That was one of the things that broke me out of thinking about thinking low carb, just like you were talking about. Low carb was the only way to be healthy, and people needed to eat fewer carbs, et cetera, et cetera. It's like I got married to a woman from Japan, and then I started spending time in Japan, and then I saw like everybody was eating carbs, but the obesity rate is much, much lower over there. And so it's very frustrating, actually, knowing what we know. And it's almost like we see it, it's like very clear, and it's like not even that complicated, that it's obvious that it's not just carbs, but it's like other people just don't have that knowledge and or those experiences and can't wrap their mind around it. Like if you say like something like, oh, for example, Nassim Nicholas Taleb, the guy who wrote Black Swan. He's like, he's this really big guy. Yes, exactly. Yeah. So he, like, when you mention this to him, he'll be like, oh, the reason for that is genetics. Like, it's just they can handle more carbs, And
right, yeah.
It's incredible. It's incredible because this has been many.
No wonder I haven't read any of his books, by the way. Yeah. No wonder I haven't read any of his books.
Don't. He's crazy. He's insane. I'm sure he's brilliant in his own way, but he has the sort of Tim Noakes sort of, I don't know. I'm talking a lot of shit on your podcast, but that's just, well, you can delete it if you want to. So, but he has this sort of Tim Noakes mentality of, I'm super intelligent. I've been super successful in my life. Every new thing that I'm going to talk about, it's going to be gold, just like everything else was. It's almost like he feels he doesn't need to critically think about things anymore. It's a really weird thing that happens to these old guys.
He's self-validated, Kevin.
It's crazy.
He just looks in the mirror and says, "You are right."
Exactly.
Sorry, man.
So he says, so you'll get people who say these kinds of things, but it's like But we know that's not true. We know that people who are diabetic on a higher carb diet can actually lose weight and then reverse their diabetes. We know that people have been eating lots of carbs for thousands of years. So it's very frustrating because the more that I understand, the more I almost want to sort of back out of the whole nutrition science communication space, just because it's so silly. It's not based on evidence, and pretty much everything I try, and this is a lot of people who are my friends as well feel this way as well. Pretty much all we say, we keep saying it, nothing ever changes. So as far as I'm concerned, like, we need fundamental cultural and institutional change in order to make these changes. We can do small things in the meantime. We can, release podcasts, do these videos, et cetera, showing that it's about weight loss. And by the way, the whole idea that weight loss is important for type 2 diabetes, it's the main driver of type 2 diabetes remission and of onset. Of course, on a genetic background, you need the genetic background as well, or the genetic background helps, certainly. But
you mean the polygenic obesity?
Yeah. So some people are just going to have lower rates of, and not even that. I mean, we don't even know it necessarily, if it's necessarily genetic. It could also be epigenetic, so you could inherit it like directly from through their lifestyle practices that can then cause you to have a worse insulin sensitivity. But basically, you can have like half the rate of glucose oxidation if you're an offspring of somebody who had diabetes without having diabetes yourself, and that puts you at risk. And so when you start gaining that weight, you're going to more quickly get diabetes than somebody else who doesn't have that defect. And that's a well-documented defect. So that's mainstream science. Like, there's nobody as far as I am aware, there's nobody within the mainstream of diabetes research who contests the basic ideas of the twin cycles hypothesis, which is of type 2 diabetes. And so we have to go online and we have to hear so many different people with all these alternative ideas that have nothing to do with the science, and there's very little way for the population to understand that that's not real science, even though it sounds plausible. The last thing I'll say is there's another vein of thinking that these sensationalizers are really finding a place in, a way to mine that, and that is, I think there's a lot of resentment towards elites right now. Look at the election. Look at the election of Donald Trump. Look at Bernie Sanders, and I think that's a lot that fuels this as well. There's distrust of elites. There's thinking that elites are corrupt. They're trying to take advantage of people, and then so that the rhetoric of extreme diet proponents takes advantage of these resentments that exist, and so that's something else that also, like, fundamentally needs to be dealt with if we're going to deal with rampant misinformation. And the more that we start having these kinds of problems where, I don't know, we could talk about it, but for a long time, but economic inequality, if it keeps getting worse and worse, we're going to have more of these issues in America. I mean, if you look at Japan, for example, one thing that they have is they have this homogeneous diet culture that is healthful, but they also have a relatively homogeneous socioeconomic situation where it's very different for us, where there's a very wide variety of different living situations that people find themselves in. So that might also impair the ability of people to be healthy in that way. I know, and I'm starting to ramble as well, Ted. So
no, you're making great points here because, I get a little bit rambly too. Maybe that's why it doesn't bother me, but you're trying to explain the nuances in the state that we find ourselves in and why it's so hard to figure things out. Why can't we just rely on, like you said, we're back in the 20s or whatever, where toxins, the gut dysbiosis is the reason why we're fat. It's not calories. It's not even carbs. And it's like, oh, I've read gut health. Maybe that's what it is. And we're in this situation. And like you mentioned, the inequality, it's something I'm very passionate about. And I don't know how, I have not been to Japan, but I'll tell you, I've been to Vietnam, I've been to Malaysia, I've been to Thailand, I've been to Hong Kong, I've been to Indonesia. And you start to see like the inequality, it's huge. And it's, it's something that especially in America, we feel like or at least there's groups of people who feel so oppressed. But, we're in a situation where we find ourselves like, well, we're able to criticize the powers that be, because in a lot of countries you can't do that. Like the one that I'm in right now. And like you said, the gatekeepers are gone. Everybody's online. Everybody has an opinion. And there is a lot of resentment. And it's, I would even argue at a deeper, more fundamental and less left brain situation, we're all more stressed. We're all more sleep deprived. We're all more, than we used to be, just generally speaking. And it's got our amygdalas hijacked, man, and then we have this thing on Twitter. I mean, you know how it is, especially you, the bigger the following, people say things on Twitter, it gets triggered, you get angry, and you're like, I don't even know this person, or maybe even what they're actually trying to say. And we're not living our lives in reality. We're living them online. We're the most disconnected, disembodied people who've ever existed ever. And, we're trying to find some way of making ourselves happy. And sometimes people are happy when they're being unhappy and arguing on, Twitter for the ketogenic diet or for whatever.
Yeah. Because it makes people feel
crazy
righteous,
situation.
Right? They feel righteous. They feel like they're correct, and they're fighting the good fight. They're fighting, battle good against evil, right? And that gives people a lot of, I think that's one thing that people need. People need to feel like they're making the world better and doing the right thing. And sometimes something that can really mobilize people is having an enemy. And that's, it's a kind of a dark side of human nature. And I think Twitter really exploits that. So
sure, absolutely. Social media
and then we just get hooked into it.
People
and we get hooked into these battles.
People retweet or comment on things that they're pissed off about. How many people just come out of nowhere and then leave a negative comment? It's like, who even are you? We've never had any conversation. You've been following me, and then you didn't even put it in context and say, you know what? Hey, listen, man, really appreciate most of what you do, but on this, I kind of disagree. Do you mind explaining further what you mean by it? No, it's just they come out of the blue and then leave negative comments. And I'll tell you something, Kevin. I have a coaching program, one-on-one coaching program, group coaching program, and I get people in it by telling them I'm going to help them lose fat, get them in shape, and do all these other things, and I do all that. But the thing that I focus on the most is the psychology, and or if you want to put it in more colloquial terms, the mindset, because we're spending so much time on, I'm a big fan of Brene Brown's work, in that she talks about how we're all turning to these numbing types of behaviors instead of stepping up in our lives. And for you, a guy like you, you're stepping up, man. You're getting your PhD, you're getting your MD PhD, you're on to big things. It'll be amazing to see what you end up doing. For me, I've got my business running. My clients get great results. They get, they not just lose fat and get in great shape, but I work with them to step up in their lives so they don't transition. What I've found is a lot of people, they go from, and probably a lot of people who are really arguing about diets go like this. They're unhealthy and they're indulging their unhappiness in unhealthy ways. They're trying to manage their unhappiness in unhealthy ways, overeating, eating hyperpalatable foods that, all the stuff that we know, spending too much time online, and then they transition it and start eating better. And then all of a sudden it's like, it's just, they didn't solve the underlying issue, right? Because there are plenty of people who overexercise or eat too extreme and develop eating disorders. We know that from the dietitians. I think you shared a paper on Twitter talking about dietitians and their eating disorders. I think that was you, right?
Yeah.
And figure competitors and their eating disorders. And it's like, we've got to stop bouncing from one extreme to the other and fix the fucking psychological issues that we're all struggling with.
Yeah. That's what I've noticed. I've recently started doing nutritional counseling as well. It's in the mind and it's in the psychology. That's where the issue is. I would say 90% of it is. And then once you can deal with that, then sort of managing all these different aspects of your life, the things that you have to discipline yourself, all that other stuff becomes so much easier because you're not dealing with this roller coaster and this that's pushing you and pulling you in these different directions. You're trying to compensate and in response to emotional turmoil. And then you can just make rational decisions. Yeah. So totally, 100%. I agree. People need to get their mind straight. That's really hard for a lot of people though. They don't know what to do.
Yeah. It's hard for you. I've got a story too, man. My mother died when I was 14. My brother was kidnapped and murdered. I mean, everyone has their own story. And we all, no matter if it's a divorce or what you went through that made you so angry or what I went through that made me angry or, we all gotta, deal with that stuff so that we stop shitting all over each other
in healthy
social
ways, right?
media.
Yeah, we got to deal with it in healthy ways, right? But I feel like our culture doesn't teach us how to deal with that in healthy ways.
It doesn't.
And
totally
we have to learn about like meditation or the proper ways of thinking about failure and other people's failures, and then how to avoid getting into these negative emotional loops. Like we don't get educated in that. Whereas I think everybody should be educated in that. Like I think, like I'm trying to educate my 4-year-old daughter in that right now because I feel like if she has those tools to keep her mind together, it's going to help her so much. Whereas we focus on like learning the alphabet, learning math, all these other things. Why don't we learn like good mental health strategies? Because everybody's going to deal with problems in their lives. And a really substantial proportion of people are going to deal with these problems to the extent that they're going to have mental health problems. So why aren't we helping people with their mental health? And I think everything will get better as far as their happiness. And even as you're saying, their physical health will be made easier as well. And it's sad that for whatever reason, we haven't decided to make that a priority in our society.
Yeah, more people. I mean, I want to kind of wrap up here because we're going on for an hour. I feel like we could easily pull a Joe Rogan and do 3 here, because we're just really starting to open up and getting into what probably really people need to hear, which is about this stuff, like dealing with the mental health issues, or, to say it in a less sciencey way, just stepping up in your life and making sure that all that energy that you're using to argue on Twitter or to do, I keep mentioning Twitter, by the way, if you're listening, because of Kevin and his popularity / infamy on Twitter. And, we got to take that energy and start putting it into things that give us some real return on our investment of our one most important and non-renewable resource, which is our time. Yeah. Kevin, I've got a bunch of questions, man. We're at an hour. I think we've answered a lot of them, but you want to hit maybe 2 or 3 just to make people happy? Because we did ask people. I'll just pick up the best ones.
Let's do it.
So, do macronutrient distribution patterns impact longevity? Let's not talk too much about like, leucine and mTOR and explaining all that. But what's the Cliff Notes version? Because most of the psychological stuff that we talked about is what people need to focus on anyway.
Yeah, totally. I agree 100%. And all the rest of this stuff is just going to be cool for nerds or for people who like already think they have everything perfect, which is going to be like 1% of people listening probably. So yes, I think it can. Okay, I'll go two angles of this: protein, and then actually let's talk about calories. Calories are going to be the most important thing, right? You want to maintain a lean body weight, and you want to be relatively lowish in your body fat. Lowish meaning for males, I would say below 20% body fat, and then for females, you'd probably have a better.
It depends. It's like 24 to 26, but then you see the
so something like
is what they say.
Yeah,
but you're not looking lean and sexy until you get to 20 and under, though.
Yeah. So for men, I would say below 20%, maybe even leaner would be better, maybe even below 15. I'm not sure. We don't actually know, but we do know that the leaner you are, that's strongly associated with better health outcomes. Muscle is also really important as well, but don't gain a bunch of muscle at the expense of gaining a bunch of fat. So in that vein, protein intake is really important because in order to gain muscle, you need protein, period. I've tried for like 3 years straight as like a hardcore vegan, eating almost only potatoes, trying to gain muscle. And I was training hard. It just doesn't work. And actually my joints were real messed up. So you need protein, contrary to what some crazy people on the internet will say. And actually protein will independently improve body composition. And again, less fat mass and more muscle mass, you're going to be better off in terms of longevity in general until you get to be like gigantic, but within reasonable levels. So I'd say that as far as calories and protein. Now, when you're looking at the animal models, protein restriction is maybe like 10% as important as calorie restriction. You're going to get much less benefit for a much higher restriction. And then you're going to also lose out on a lot of things, which is function, and you're going to be more frail and all these other things. So I'd say if you're going to think about calories or protein, focus overwhelmingly on calories. And I'm not sure that protein is much of an issue. There might,
especially when heart disease is the number one killer, right?
Totally. Okay. So then the next thing I would say is let's talk about fat versus carbs. There are 2 animal studies I think were released either in 2015 or 2016 by this group. First off, Newman and Verdon. That's one group, and the other group had the first author was Roberts, and it also had Keith Barr on it. And I'm not sure if you've had Keith on the podcast, but he did this interesting ketogenic diet study in rodents, and both of them showed the same thing, which is that you get a moderate lifespan extension, and not just a moderate midlife survival extension. So more animals lived past midlife, and they died not on average, but on I think the ketogenic diet mice died later, so they had a longer life, and they had better physical and cognitive function. So that mice that were on the ketogenic diet actually did better on memory and cognitive tests than the young mice that they got into the study at the very beginning. So at 3 years, they did better than they did at 1 year, which is really a fascinating and outstanding result. I think that was really interesting. Okay, so that's a mouse study. That's one thing to note. Second thing is there's no good evidence for that in humans. Third thing is they were on that for their entire lives. So I don't know how many people are going to be able to keep on a ketogenic diet for their entire lives, but it's a really interesting study. High fat, all those other kind of macronutrient ratios don't seem to make any difference. Actually, whenever they compared it to a high fat diet, but that was not ketogenic, and they did it in these same studies, they saw no improvement. So you have to be strictly speaking ketogenic. And the protein was matched. So that was something I felt confident about. So, but these are just mouse studies. They're preliminary. They're very exciting. The main takeaway I would say is, for example, for me, I'm not going to go on a ketogenic diet for the rest of my life because I can't do that. And I would
carbs are delicious.
Carbs are delicious.
And I like to train hard in the gym too.
I like to train hard in the gym. I don't like to feel like crap a lot of times. Yeah, that's another thing.
Yeah.
But and the other thing is you could do ketogenic diet cycling. The only thing I would recommend that people do if they do try to do ketogenic diet cycling is don't go on keto for 2 weeks and then go on a high carb diet in 1 day, because you're going to really jack up your blood glucose to really high levels, and you're going to probably cause vascular damage, so damage to your blood vessels. And if you do that over time, over a long period of time, my guess would be that you'd raise your cardiovascular disease risk. And the reason I say this is because this guy named John Little showed that markers of vascular damage went up after just one bolus of glucose after being on a ketogenic diet for a short period of time. And that's because you lose insulin sensitivity. So what you want to do is you want to gradually reintroduce carbs to go back to a higher carb diet, and then gradually go back. You could probably quickly go back to a ketogenic diet, but in the transition from a ketogenic diet to a high carb diet, you want to be very gradual to reduce the chance of really high blood glucose levels and blood vessel damage. So that's long answer, but
that was good, man. Yeah. There's some good questions here. I think we got everything. Do you want to handle one more, you think, or?
We could do one more. I'm always happy. I'm always down.
Yeah, I love to talk too. And we got to get you back on the show, man. I didn't know how you were going to be talking to you. It's kind of exciting, but just it was really cool that, we connect on a lot of different levels, have some parallels even on our life path. Although I did not I wanted to do an MD PhD program, but that did not happen for me. Well, the last one, I think this is kind of interesting. So this is a person who asked, I was wondering if there's data to establish a causal relationship between obesity and diseases. And you already kind of answered that. Although if you want to expound on it a bit more, happy to indulge this person. But then she said also thoughts on fat shaming and tips how to shut it up. That might be kind of an interesting one to end on. This person is probably like health at as soon as someone says that, I'm thinking health at every size.
Yes.
Right? Which is misconstrued to mean that you can be healthy no matter what size you are, which is untrue. I mean, at least by, all the best evidence, to use that word again, all the best scientific studies and what we know about human health, but you can engage in healthy behaviors. Do you want to talk about whether there's more of a causal or correlational relationship between excess body fat and diseases?
Okay, well, this is actually something I wanted to talk about. Like, I forgot to talk about near the very beginning. Is like for humans, it's really, really difficult to establish causal relationships in the domain of health, and the reason is very simple: is we can't take a human from birth and put them in a cage and then feed them or do one thing to them and then eventually like see what the outcome is going to be and then compare it to other kids.
Right.
We can't do that. So what we have to do in nutrition and health sciences, we have to indirectly
they do it in China
test
though,
a lot
I think.
They do?
I probably shouldn't say that. No, I'm kidding.
If they do, sign me up. I'm just kidding too. So no, I mean, I need some subjects. I would like to be involved in this research. I'm just kidding. No, but seriously, Chinese government, I'm here.
Yeah, I know, right? We're just kidding, Chinese government. Please don't flag this podcast when we tweet it out. Please, I still want to come and see the Great Wall. Please don't ban me.
So, so we have to indirectly test a lot of these hypotheses, especially in terms of longevity. Like we can easily look at drug interventions that have an effect that's pretty quick, but in terms of like these things that take place over a really long period of time, it's much more difficult to directly test these things. I will say that I'm trying to think if there's been any weight loss studies where they've shown after weight loss a reduction in event rate of disease events. I'm not sure that that's actually been shown. If not, that needs to be shown. So do we have...
Well, we know that fat loss, quote unquote, reverses or puts into remission, however you like to, whatever term you want to use for diabetes, though.
Yeah, but what you need to show, just to play the devil's advocate, you'd need to show that would actually result in, like, say, fewer heart attacks, fewer complications, and fewer events, and all those kinds of things. We don't know that that's like. I would assume that would be the case, and I would be shocked if that data doesn't exist. But I don't have it off the top of my head, that data. That person, I'll go ahead and find them a study and tweet it out to them, because I saw that their response on Twitter. I'll go ahead and find a couple studies for them showing stuff like that. But off the top of my head, I can't think of anything. Usually most of the time it's like for type 1 diabetics, they've shown if they control blood glucose better, then they get fewer cardiovascular complications. But I don't know for sure if we've ever seen that directly with weight loss. That would be the direct test, right? So,
yeah. I don't know if we want to dive into fat shaming. I think we kind of talked about that with the social media, the state of the situation, and should we regulate people who say mean things on Twitter, and specifically to shaming about fat, or what about fit shaming or other types of shame? I mean, shaming people isn't good.
I have a kind of an edgy,
doesn't motivate them.
Yeah, I have a kind of an edgy thing to say about this. And I'm still, just the caveat is I'm still trying to figure this out. So if anybody has any good research or like wants to show me how I'm wrong, I'll be open to it. I'll tweet it out too. So like I like to tweet out people who show me that I'm wrong. We know from the research that shaming fat people doesn't cause them to become more motivated. Actually, it seems to make things worse. It makes them like have worse inflammatory markers. They binge eat more. The other thing is just like telling them, oh, you need to do this, as opposed to encouraging them. People actually, there's a correlation between that and getting worse results. Of course, you need to instruct people, but being very enthusiastic and supportive is incredibly important for helping people who want to lose weight. So that said,
so stop shaming people, you people
seriously
who are shaming others.
Seriously,
it doesn't work.
That said, though, what I'm curious about is when we look at this, people who are obese, like almost by definition, it's like fat shaming hasn't worked because we live in a fat shaming society, right? So by definition, it hasn't worked. But the question I would have is, what about the people who are thin? Is like negative attitudes about fatness, has that helped them to maintain their thinness? And I don't know if that's ever been studied. So I would be very cautious. I mean, not cautious. I would never I don't think fat shaming is the right thing to do to anybody. But
agreed.
The idea that we shouldn't have negative attitudes about fatness, and that, like, would we lose something if we lost those negative attitudes? Would actually more people be fat? And I don't know what the answer is to that. Like, I don't know if anybody's answered that. If somebody could like comment on this and like scream at me, that I'm wrong, it'd be great. But like for me, I don't want to be fat, right? Like, but I guess the question is,
I was fat.
Yeah,
it's 23% body fat. Yeah.
Yeah, I've also been fat before. And
11-ish. Yeah.
But
I'm not going back.
I guess the question, I guess the question would be, for me, is that actually helping me to keep my weight low? Is that a main thing that's helping me, or is it just something I think is helping me? Like, do I just think that that's helping me, or it's actually other things? Does it make sense? So,
what specifically, what like the negative attitudes in society about you having a certain body fat percentage, having a higher body fat percentage, you mean? Like, is that negativity helping us stay lean?
Like, yeah, because if I look in the mirror, I'm like, oh my God, I'm like, oh my God, I'm so fat. I have to deal with this, like, and I have this negative attitude about it. I have to deal with this. Like that negative attitude that's not a big thing. That's not like something, I'm not like obsessed about it, but it's something that happens every once in a while. I'll like look in the mirror, I'm like shit, like I see, these, whatever, it's not perfect. And so that's something that sometimes motivates me to cut back a little bit. It's certainly something that's in my mind on a somewhat regular basis. I don't know, maybe I'm just like, I'm now painting myself as somebody who's really unhealthy, but I think everybody who's living, what about you, Ted? Do you have like sometimes negative thoughts about your body composition? You're like, oh, I need it. Because I feel like there's a body composition you have, and there's also an ideal body composition. And then you're constantly evaluating yourself in terms of that. At least I am. I'm trying not to do it in an unhealthy way. I don't get to do extreme diets. I don't endorse any sort of extreme diet or binge eating or whatever. And I try to also be forgiving and kind to myself as well. And I think that's also really important, or otherwise I'd drive myself crazy. But I do have these negative attitudes as well. And so I wonder what you think about that.
So I had a little bit of a different thing. I felt I had a negative body images, negative body issues. It's like 10:57 over here. So if I stumble over my
I'll
words,
let you go soon. Sorry.
That is no. Please, I'm really enjoying our conversation a lot. But I was a thin kid. I grew up in Miami, got bullied, ironically, for most of the time for being a white guy. Right? Because it's predominantly Hispanic. And so I wanted to be bigger and stronger and more powerful. And so like I found myself in my mid-30s. I was lean and mean throughout my 20s. I got a brown belt in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu, did a bunch of competitions, but I still felt like I'm not walking around with that brown belt on. So nobody knows, nobody cares. Right. So I want to get bigger. And so I got fat. I got muscle fat because I didn't know what I was doing. Right. That's the term I use for like the guys who they're filling out their shirts. They look big and strong. And I was actually, strong, decently strong. But the body fat percentage, when I finally measured it, was 22 or 23%. I can't remember. And I thought I was like doing great. And I didn't think there was a problem. And then one of my friends from jujitsu, we have a good, back and forth with each other. He was like, "Oh, hey man, you doing some cardio? Because, you're looking like Captain Back Fat right now." And I'm like, "What are you talking about?" So that's what kind of, my negative body images actually led me to get bigger at any sort of cost. My feelings of like, I need to be bigger and, need more respect and everything. And I'm pretty lean right now. I was up at 210 at that point. Now I'm, I think 185 now. Their scales aren't so many scales available in Southeast Asia. They've got an obesity epidemic, but that, when they call it that, you're like, well, but everybody's thin here, because it's so vastly, it's so much smaller of an epidemic here than it is in, most Western industrialized countries. But so that's kind of where I came from. But I will say this, man, I think we're so harsh with each other right now, right? We all need to find a way to say, hey, listen, being fat doesn't make you a bad person. In fact, maybe something bad happened to you. Maybe you got super busy and you were putting your kids first. Maybe your wife got hurt and you were taking things over and you were so stressed you started to overeat. That doesn't make you a bad person. That makes you a person who stepped up and did the right thing, but you kind of lost your health in the process. And so we need to we need to acknowledge people for that, but also say, hey, listen, but it's not good. It's great that you're overcame, or, we feel bad if you went through something harsh, but at the same time, it's predisposing you to problems. And we need to be honest about that as well. And that's what concerns me about movements like health at every size and at the more extreme parts of that. I love the idea in theory, but the way it's played out, at least through the vocal minority, I think is unhealthy.
Okay. So I think maybe this will help a little bit so I mentioned that fat people we live in a fat shaming society, and in some ways we're almost, I would say maybe even worse than ever, or at least we were up to like maybe a few years ago. Like we're almost, but yet people are still becoming obese, right? So obviously what fat shaming is not working. Obviously it's something else that needs to change to deal with this problem. So people who say all we need to do is, people just need to be fat shamed, like Mao, what is that guy's name?
Stop being fat. Just stop eating.
I think that's obviously not going to help. And that's not going to be the solution. So people who think that's the solution, just if we have better norms or whatever, just they don't know what they're talking about. So I think we could say that much for sure. So, and I do think health at every size is great as far as body positivity is concerned. I think that people should, like all the clients that I help, I try to make them feel good about themselves, because often it's sometimes them feeling bad about themselves that's driving the overeating.
Absolutely.
So, so I think that's a good part. But then the sort of the denial of science is the dangerous part, which reminds me a lot of the keto cult. But yeah, so. That's
love to say that for round 2, man. Can't even talk about keto right now.
Oh my goodness.
Well, listen, Kevin, we've been at this for a good hour 20 right now, and man, it's just a pleasure to speak with you, and an honor to be the first podcast to have you on. And we got to do this again. So I know you want to, well, at least you mentioned you want to kind of back off from putting stuff out there, but I would say please don't. And, please do more of these, because I think we need more people like you. And we need more people. You and I are the types of people who need to be more active. And I think that at the end of the day, we can't be the tugboat who tries to drag all the broken down boats towards the truth. We got to be the lighthouse, man. Just shine brightly. And if people are drunk at the helm and crash into the rocks, well, hey, there's a lighthouse out there, but you got to learn how to find it on your own.
I think that's really well said, and a really important perspective that I think people who are in the science communication world should pay close attention to, because we can't carry the world on our shoulders, and personal responsibility is going to be an important thing. We don't live in China, so so yeah, this has been great. I'm going to keep doing stuff. Hopefully, I'll have some better and better YouTube videos. I think that's more what I want to transition to in the long term, and less tweets and more videos. And so let's do this again whenever it seems opportune.
Awesome. Right. Yeah, would love to do a video interview and put it up. I think that's a really important point. We got to shift mediums so that we can have, to Joe Rogan's credit, he's doing that with the long form interviews where he really takes the time to dive in things. So I'm really looking forward to seeing you on there too, because I know you've been invited. But Kevin, where would you like people to follow you? You got a YouTube channel, you got a Twitter. Do you have a website that you'd like people to go to?
Yeah, you can follow me on Twitter at Kevin Bass. So that's Kevin, and then there's another N. So it's like Kevin with two N's, and then Bass, Bass. And then you can also follow me at my blog, which actually has all my content. I'm going to put all my videos up there pretty soon. Is just Nutritional Revolution. That's nutritional, AL, revolution.org. O-R-G. And my YouTube channel, I'm still working on it. So it's still in its nascent phases. So, if you guys stumble across it, that's good, but I'm not going to shout it out to all my still working on that. So, go try my website and try my Twitter channel or Twitter feed, and ask me any questions you want. If you have any questions about this episode or complaints, or if you want to report me somewhere, you can try on through Twitter, and I'll respond. Best thing to do is to follow me before you ask any questions, because I actually filter out all the tweets of anybody who doesn't follow me, just because I don't have the time to answer everybody. So if you want to follow me and complain, and then you want to unfollow me, that would be good too. Cool.
We'll have all of that in the show notes for this episode. Kevin Bass, thanks so much, man. Just an absolute pleasure connecting with you, and looking forward to doing it again soon.
Thanks, Ted.
That's it for now. Speak to you soon.